Before we get in the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. A quiet neighborhood, a home with a well-maintained yard, and a homeowner who enjoys his peace until the HOA decides to interfere. The protagonist, a confident and sharp-witted man, has lived on his property for years, free from the tyranny of a homeowners association. His house stands out in subtle ways. Nothing outrageous, but enough to irritate the self-appointed enforcers of neighborhood harmony. Maybe it's the American flag flying proudly on his porch, the vintage muscle car parked in the driveway, or simply the fact that he doesn't conform to their manufactured sense of order. One morning, a letter appears on his doorstep, bold red letters demanding his immediate compliance with HOA regulations. The paper is filled with accusations: violation of mailbox uniformity, unauthorized paint color, non-compliant landscaping. Confused, he schemes through the nonsense, knowing one thing for certain: he's not part of the HOA. He never signed anything, never agreed to their rules. His house predates the HOA's formation, exempt from their authority. Yet here they are, attempting to strong-arm him into submission. Shrugging it off, he crumples the letter and tosses it into the recycling bin. He expects it to be the end of it, a simple misunderstanding that will clear up once he ignores their baseless claims. But later that afternoon, a knock on the door signals otherwise. Standing on his porch is a woman in her late 50s, wearing an HOA badge like she's a government official. Her expression is one of thinly veiled superiority, her arms crossed as if she's already won. "I assume you got our notice," she begins without preamble. "I did," he replies, "and I assume you know I'm not in your HOA." Her smile is sharp. "That's what we need to discuss." He gestures lazily. "There's nothing to discuss. My house isn't under your jurisdiction." "That's incorrect," she says smoothly, pulling out a clipboard. "This entire neighborhood follows HOA guidelines, and we can't make exceptions." He leans against the doorframe, unimpressed. "You don't have authority over my property." Her expression tightens. "Sir, we're trying to maintain community standards. If you refuse to comply, there will be consequences." He raises an eyebrow. "Like what? A sternly worded letter?" She exhales sharply, clearly not used to defiance. "Fines, potential legal action. We have ways of ensuring compliance." That amuses him. "Oh yeah? Try it. Let's see how well that goes." With a final glare, she turns on her heel, storming off as if she's won the argument. But he knows this is just the beginning. The HOA isn't going to back down, and he's about to find out just how far they're willing to go. The next morning, the protagonist wakes up to an unusual sight: a bright orange warning notice taped to his front door. The HOA's demands have escalated. The paper lists a series of supposed violations, each more absurd than the last. His grass is 0.75 inches too tall, his mailbox clashes with the aesthetic vision of the community, and his car parked in his own driveway. He finds a notice. But the kicker is the final warning: failure to comply will result in further action, up to and including legal intervention. Chuckling, he crumples the notice and tosses it into the trash. He's seen power-hungry people before, but this level of pettiness is something else. He decides to ignore them, but it doesn't take long before the HOA shifts into high gear. That afternoon, he spots the same woman from the previous day, the HOA enforcer, standing across the street speaking with two other board members. Their eyes dart toward his house as they whisper, their self-importance radiating from their stiff postures. Minutes later, a landscaper truck pulls up. A uniformed worker steps out, confused but holding a work order. The protagonist watches as the HOA enforcer gestures toward his yard. The worker hesitates, clearly uncertain. That's when the protagonist steps outside. "Can I help you?" The landscaper looks uncomfortable, holding up the paperwork. We were called out to trim the yard to HOA standards." He folds his arms, smirking. "That's funny because I didn't call anyone." The HOA enforcer steps in, her tone clipped. "We took the liberty of hiring landscapers for you, since you refused to maintain your property to code. The HOA will handle it, and the cost will be added to your outstanding fines." He lets out a low laugh. "Lady, you must be out of your mind. I don't have outstanding fines because I'm not in your HOA." her lips pressed together. You live in this neighborhood. That makes you part of the association. Wrong. My property predates your HOA. I have legal documents proving I'm not under your jurisdiction. The landscaper, realizing he's in the middle of something way above his pay grade, mutters, I think I'll head out, before getting back in his truck and pulling away. The HOA woman glares at him. You can't just ignore the rules. He shrugs. I absolutely can. Her face turns red, her frustration bubbling over. You think you're above the law? He gives her a slow grin. No, I just think you have no idea how the law works. She storms off without another word, but within the hour, an HOA letter is in his mailbox, stamped with final warning in bold red ink. That evening, the neighborhood starts buzzing with the HOA's latest stunt. Some neighbors seem amused by the escalating battle, others uneasy, but a few start treating him differently, stepping away when he walks by or muttering under their breath. Clearly, the HOA is trying to turn people against him. The next day, the escalation hits a new level of insanity. The HOA enforcer, now emboldened, calls the police. 2 officers arrive at his doorstep, looking mildly annoyed but professional. Sir, we received a complaint from the Homeowners Association about a dispute over property regulations. He sighs, rubbing his temples. You gotta be kidding me. The HOA woman stands behind them, arms crossed triumphantly. The officer, clearly expecting an easy resolution, asks, Are you refusing to comply with the HOA's rules? I'm not in the HOA, he says flatly. The officers glance at each other before looking back at the HOA representative. Ma'am, is he actually part of the HOA? She stiffens. He lives here. That means he's under our guidelines. The officer turns back to him. Sir, do you have proof that your property isn't under the HOA's jurisdiction? Without missing a beat, he steps inside, grabs a folder from his desk, and hands it over. Knock yourself out. The officer flips through the documents, his expression neutral. Then, after a moment, he closes the folder and hands it back. Looks like you're right. The HOA woman gasps. What? He still has to comply with community standards. The officer turns to her, his patience clearly wearing thin. Ma'am, he's not legally obligated to follow your HOA's regulations. She stutters, but the officer gives her a look. Unless he's breaking any actual laws, there's nothing we can do. The HOA woman's face twists in fury, but she has no choice but to back down, at least for now. As the officers drive away, the protagonist leans against his doorway, watching her struggle to keep her composure. Finally, she glares at him and hisses, This isn't over. He grins. I was hoping you'd say that. The protagonist knows one thing for certain. The HOA won't back down, which means neither will he. If they want to fight, they're going to get one. But instead of playing by their ridiculous rules, he decides to turn the tables in a way they won't see coming. The next morning, he wakes up to a fresh round of passive-aggressive tactics. A bright yellow violation sign is planted on his lawn, courtesy of the HOA, warning him that he's in non-compliance with community standards. A second letter is shoved into his mailbox, despite the fact that the last time he checked, tampering with mail was a federal offense. This one is even more aggressive, threatening escalating fines and further legal measures. He's tempted to let it go, but where's the fun in that? Instead, he takes the violation sign, carries it over to the HOA president's house, and plants it in their perfectly manicured front lawn. Just for good measure, he snaps a picture and posts it in the neighborhood Facebook group with the caption, Guess I'm not the only one violating these sacred community standards. Within minutes, the group chat explodes. Neighbors who secretly despise the HOA love it. Others, the HOA loyalists, are outraged, and the HOA president, she loses her mind. That afternoon, she's back at his doorstep, this time with 2 other board members in tow. You think this is funny? She snaps, waving her phone, which is clearly displaying his post. He smirks. I think it's hilarious. She seethes. You're mocking the rules that keep this neighborhood in order. No, I'm mocking the ridiculous idea that you think you can enforce them on me. One of the board members, a balding man who looks like he hasn't had a fun day in decades, clears his throat. Let's just keep this civil. The fact, remains that your property is not in line with the HOA's expectations. He crosses his arms, and the fact remains that I don't care. The HOA president's face turns red. If you don't comply, we'll take legal action. He laughs. Oh, please do. I'd love to see you explain to a judge why you think you have authority over a house that's legally not part of your HOA. She falters for a split second, but then recovers. You'll see. And with that, they storm off, leaving him standing there more amused than ever. But the real war is just beginning. The next week, the HOA shifts to underhanded tactics. It starts with petty harassment. His garbage bins mysteriously go missing on trash day, only to reappear a few blocks away. His sprinklers suddenly stop working, and when he checks the system, he finds someone tampered with it. HOA complaints start piling up about noise violations, which is ironic because he's been out of town for 3 days. Then things escalate. A contractor shows up at his house claiming he was hired by the HOA to fix violations on the property. The kicker? The bill would be charged to his own address. I didn't hire you, he tells the guy. The contractor sighs, clearly exhausted, figuring these HOA types pull this stunt all the time. Furious, the protagonist digs into legal avenues. He gathers every piece of documentation that proves he is not under their jurisdiction. He reaches out to a lawyer and gets confirmation that if the HOA continues harassing him, he can sue them for harassment and trespassing. That's when he gets an idea. If they want to play dirty, he can play smarter. The next morning, he mails formal cease and desist letters to the HOA board members. He also includes a copy of his legal exemption and CCs his lawyer in the email chain. But he's not done. Since the HOA loves making rules, he decides to play their own game against them. He starts researching every single violation that the HOA board members are guilty of, and it turns out there are plenty. The HOA president? She's been using HOA funds for personal expenses. The VP? He built a backyard deck without permits. The head of enforcement? His own lawn is technically out of compliance with the HOA's landscaping rules. Armed with this information, he starts leaking details in the neighborhood chat. Within days, the HOA's credibility starts crumbling. Neighbors begin questioning their leadership. People start filing their own complaints against the HOA board. Some even stop paying their dues in protest, demanding transparency. The best part? The HOA president is furious but powerless because technically, the protagonist has done nothing illegal. He simply exposed the truth. For the first time, the HOA is on the defensive, and he's just getting started. The neighborhood is no longer the quiet, cookie-cutter community the HOA had once controlled with an iron fist. Ever since the protagonist started pushing back, the balance of power has shifted. What was once an unspoken fear of the HOA, retaliation is now turning into open rebellion, and the neighbors are taking sides. Some residents, the HOA loyalists, refuse to believe their beloved association is in the wrong. They double down, whispering amongst themselves, accusing the protagonist of being a troublemaker. These are the people who have lived under the HOA's thumb for so long that they've convinced themselves it's necessary. But then there are the rebels, the ones who have quietly suffered under the HOA's absurd rules for years, never daring to speak out. The protagonist's defiance has awakened something in them. At first, it starts small. A neighbor named Tom, who always mowed his lawn at exactly the HOA-approved height, suddenly lets it grow out a little too long. Another neighbor, Lisa, known for her perfectly neutral-colored home, paints her front door a bold, unapproved shade of red. Then it escalates. A few houses down, someone parks their work truck in the driveway, a direct violation of HOA rules. Another homeowner puts up string lights in their backyard despite the HOA's ban on excessive decorative lighting. It's an unspoken rebellion, a movement brewing beneath the surface, and the HOA notices. The protagonist's mailbox starts filling up with complaints, not just about him, but about everyone else. The HOA is in full panic mode, trying to regain control, but the more they fight back, the more people resist. One evening, he's sitting on his porch when a neighbor named Frank, a retired veteran, walks over and leans against the railing. "You're giving them hell," Frank says with a chuckle. "About time someone did." The protagonist smirks. Didn't think I'd start a revolution. Frank nods toward the street. You got people thinking this HOA's been running unchecked for years. Nobody ever questioned them, but now. He gestures toward the neighborhood. They're scared. You can see it. The protagonist follows his gaze. The HOA board members are patrolling the neighborhood, clipboards in hand, faces tight with frustration as they jot down violations. But it's clear they're overwhelmed. Too many people are fighting back at once. And then something unexpected happens. A neighbor named Debbie, one of the most vocal HOA loyalists, shows up at the protagonist's door one afternoon. She's the type who always attended HOA meetings and who used to report people for having the wrong kind of lawn decorations. But now she looks nervous. I need to talk to you, she says hesitantly. He raises an eyebrow. Didn't think we were on talking terms. She sighs. Look, I thought the HOA was supposed to keep things orderly. I really did. But lately, it's different. They've been pressuring people to report their own neighbors. They sent me a letter saying if I don't cooperate, I could face fines. He leans against the door frame. And now you're realizing they don't actually care about community harmony, just control. She nods. I think they're scared of you. You're exposing them, and now they're trying to tighten their grip. She studies her for a moment before smirking. Then maybe it's time we make them really nervous. That night, a massive anonymous complaint is filed against the HOA itself. A petition circulates through the neighborhood demanding an internal audit of the HOA's finances and rule enforcement. The cracks in their authority are turning into full-blown fractures. And the best part? The protagonist isn't the one leading the charge anymore. The community is. The HOA is in full meltdown mode. The once feared enforcers of arbitrary rules are scrambling to contain the chaos. They can no longer control the rebellion that has spread. What started as one man refusing to comply has evolved into a neighborhood-wide movement of defiance. The petty citations and threats the HOA used to send out like clockwork are now ignored. The board member who used to patrol with smug authority is now greeted with sarcastic waves and knowing smirks. The once orderly streets now have colorful doors, varied mailboxes, and gasp, driveways that don't all match. And then comes the final blow. The protagonist receives a summons. The HOA, in a last-ditch effort to reassert dominance, has taken legal action against him. The document is filled with legal claims of violation of community standards, failure to comply with directives, and his personal favorite, disrupting the harmony of the neighborhood. He lets out a low laugh. They just made a huge mistake. The courtroom is packed. Word has spread through the neighborhood, and people have taken time off just to witness the downfall of the HOA. On one side, the HOA board members sit stiffly, their attorney looking mildly exasperated, probably because he's realized his clients are fighting a battle they're destined to lose. On the other side, the protagonist is calm and confident, with a stack of legal documents that prove one undeniable fact. He is not part of the HOA. The case kicks off with the HOA's attorney making a desperate attempt to argue that all homeowners in the area must comply with community standards. The judge, unimpressed, raises an eyebrow. Is his property legally under your HOA's jurisdiction? A long pause. The HOA president clears her throat. Well, it's within the neighborhood. The judge's gaze sharpens. Yes or no? Silence. The attorney sighs. No, Your Honor. And just like that, the case is over. But the protagonist isn't done. Not by a long shot. Your Honor, he says, standing, I'd like to file a counterclaim for harassment, defamation, and repeated trespassing on my property. The HOA board members collectively pale. The judge leans back. Do you have evidence? The protagonist smirks and places a thick folder on the table. Inside are copies of every letter, every unauthorized fine, video footage of HOA board members trespassing, and for the cherry on top, evidence of the HOA misusing funds. The room erupts. Gasps ripple through the audience. The HOA president looks like she's about to faint. The judge takes a moment to flip through the documents. Looking back, I'm unimpressed. This is extensive. Then comes the final sentence. The HOA is found guilty of harassment and illegal enforcement. The protagonist is awarded damages. The HOA is ordered to cease all contact with him. And the best part, an investigation is launched into the HOA's finances. The HOA board members leave the courtroom in disgrace. Their reign is over. The neighborhood is electrified. The once feared HOA has collapsed. Board members resign in disgrace, and the remaining members scramble to avoid legal repercussions. Some neighbors demand refunds for ridiculous fines they paid over the years. The protagonist hosts a massive barbecue in his backyard, grill blazing, music playing. Neighbors, many of whom were once too scared to speak out, celebrate their newfound freedom. As he flips a burger, Frank walks over, shaking his head in amusement. "Never thought I'd see the day," he says. The protagonist grins. "Told you they'd regret messing with me." Across the street, the former HOA president is moving out, stuffing boxes into her car with a look of bitter defeat. The protagonist raises his drink in a mock toast. Sweet, sweet karma. The dust has settled, and the once dreaded HOA is nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered among the remaining board members, those who haven't already resigned in shame or fled the neighborhood. The protagonist is exactly where he started, happily living his life free from anyone trying to tell him what to do with his own property. But the fallout from the HOA's downfall has been nothing short of spectacular. The investigation into the HOA's finances reveals that their emergency fund had been mismanaged for years. The former president and the treasurer are under legal review. The HOA's ability to enforce anything is completely dismantled. Then comes the final poetic touch. A letter appears in his mailbox, not from the HOA, but from the city. It's an official notification that, due to legal violations and misuse of funds, the HOA has been formally dissolved. The HOA is dead, gone, erased. The protagonist laughs. Not only did he win, but he won so thoroughly that the very organization that tried to control him no longer exists. With the HOA out of power, the neighborhood undergoes a transformation. The ridiculous uniformity rules are gone. A few houses paint their doors whatever colors they want. One guy builds a massive deck with string lights, and another neighbor sets up a fire pit in his front yard. No one is fined. No one cares. The protagonist sits on his porch one evening, watching the neighborhood finally breathe after years of suffocating under unnecessary rules. He sips his drink, enjoying the sight of a community that finally feels like home. Neighbors stop by more often now, some to chat, some to thank him for standing up when no one else would. And then there's the best part of all. The former HOA president has put her house up for sale. She's moving, packing up everything, and leaving, unable to stand living in a neighborhood where she's no longer in control. The protagonist watches her car pull out of the driveway one last time. As she drives away, he lifts his glass in a silent, mocking farewell. He never had to lift a finger to make her leave. The community did it for him. Justice served, karma delivered. And as he leans back in his chair, feeling the cool evening breeze, he smiles. Life is good.